Summary of Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is a record of the creation of the world by God in 6 days, followed by rest on the seventh day. Day 1. God created light and separated it from darkness, establishing day and night. Day 2. God created the sky, firmament, to separate the waters above from the waters below. Day 3. God gathered the waters below to form seas and revealed dry land. He then created vegetation. Day 4. God created the sun, moon, and stars to govern day and night, and to serve as signs for seasons, days, and years. Day 5. God created sea creatures and birds, blessing them to be fruitful and multiply. Day 6. God created land animals, and then created humans, male and female, in His own image. He blessed them, commanded them to be fruitful and multiply, gave them dominion over all creatures, and provided plants for food. Day 7. God completed His work and rested, blessing and sanctifying the seventh day. Summary of Genesis 2. Genesis 2 provides an account of creation from a second perspective, focusing specifically on the creation of humans and the Garden of Eden. The chapter begins by describing how God rested on the seventh day after completing the work of creation, blessing and sanctifying it as a holy day of rest, set apart from the others. It then provides a more detailed account of how God formed man, Adam, from the dust of the ground and breathed life into him. God planted a garden in Eden as a perfect home for the man and placed him there to work it and care for it. The garden had all kinds of beautiful trees that provided food, including 2 special trees in the center, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God commanded Adam that he may eat from any tree in the garden except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, warning that if he ate from it, he would surely die. 4 rivers flowed out from Eden, which are described with their geographic contexts. God observed that it was not good for the man to be alone, and made a suitable helpmeet for him. God brought all the animals to Adam to name, but none was a suitable companion. Then God caused Adam to fall into a deep sleep, took one of his ribs, and from it created a woman. When Adam saw her, he joyfully recognized her as bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and called her woman, because she was taken out of man. Genesis 2 concludes with the statement that this is why a man leaves his parents and is united with his wife, becoming one flesh. It notes that the man and woman were both naked and felt no shame. Summary of Genesis 3. Genesis 3 is the account of the rebellion of humanity, when sin first entered the world. The serpent, described as more subtle than any beast of the field, approached Eve in the Garden of Eden and questioned God's command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The serpent told Eve that eating the fruit wouldn't cause death, but would make them like God, knowing good and evil. Eve saw that the fruit looked good, desired its wisdom, and ate it. She then gave some to Adam, who also ate it. Their eyes were opened, they realized they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together in an effort to cover themselves. When they heard God walking in the garden, Adam and Eve hid. God called out to them, and Adam admitted they hid because they were naked and afraid. God asked if they ate from the forbidden tree. Adam blamed Eve, and Eve blamed the serpent. In Genesis 2, God had said that they would surely die if they ate from that tree. In Genesis 3, He described the curse that was to be the indirect consequence of humanity's rebellion. The serpent was cursed to crawl on its belly and eat dust, with enmity between it and the woman's offspring. The woman would experience pain in childbirth and be ruled by her husband. The man would toil amid thorns and thistles to produce food, eventually dying, returning to dust. God made garments out of animal skins for Adam and Eve to wear. God expelled them from Eden to prevent them from eating from the tree of life and living forever in their sinful and fallen state with the curse. God placed cherubim and a flaming sword to guard the way to the tree of life. Summary of Genesis 4. Genesis 4 is the account of Cain and Abel, the first children of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve had two sons, Cain, who became a farmer, and Abel, who became a shepherd. Both brothers brought offerings to God. Cain brought produce from his fields, while Abel brought the firstborn from his flock. God accepted Abel's offering, but rejected Cain's, causing Cain to become angry and envious. God warned Cain about the power of sin. Despite this warning, Cain lured Abel into a field and murdered him. When God asked Cain where Abel was, Cain famously replied, "Am I my brother's keeper?" God cursed Cain to be a restless wanderer on the earth and marked him so no one would kill him. Cain settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden, and built a city named after his son Enoch. Genesis 3 concludes with a brief genealogy of Cain's descendants, including Lamech, who boasted about killing a man. Adam and Eve then had another son, named Seth. Summary of Genesis 5. Genesis 5 contains the genealogy from Adam to Noah, often called the Book of the Generations of Adam. This chapter traces 10 generations through the line of Seth, Adam's son, showing the lineage that would eventually lead to Noah. The chapter follows a consistent pattern for each patriarch: name of the person, age when their firstborn son was born, how many years they lived after that, their total lifespan, brief mention of other sons and daughters. Here's the genealogical line with their ages. Adam lived 930 years. Seth lived 912 years. Enosh lived 905 years. Cainan lived 910 years. Mahalalel lived 895 years. Yared lived 962 years. Enoch lived 365 years, did not die, but walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Methuselah lived 969 years, the oldest person recorded in the Bible. Lamech lived 777 years. Noah, introduced at the end of the chapter. The chapter concludes by mentioning Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Summary of Genesis 6. Genesis 6 mentions that there were giants in the earth and includes a passage about sons of God taking daughters of men as wives, resulting in offspring described as mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. As humanity multiplied on earth, their wickedness increased dramatically. Genesis 6 says that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, causing God deep grief over creating humankind. God resolved to wipe out all living creatures from the earth because of this widespread corruption and violence. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and is described as righteous and blameless among the people of his time. God instructed Noah to build an ark of cypress wood, providing specific dimensions. The ark was to have 3 decks and rooms throughout, and it was to be covered with pitch inside and out. God announced his plan to bring a flood to destroy all life, but he established a covenant with Noah. God commanded Noah to bring his wife, sons, and his sons' wives into the ark, along with 2, male and female, of every kind of animal to keep them alive. Noah was also instructed to store food for his family and the animals. Genesis 6 concludes with Noah's obedience. According to all that God commanded him, so did he. Summary of Genesis 7. Genesis 7 is the account of the global flood. God commanded Noah to enter the ark with his family, wife, 3 sons, and their wives, because he found Noah righteous. God instructed Noah to take 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean animals, plus 7 pairs of birds, to preserve their kinds. Noah was told that in 7 days God would send rain for 40 days and nights to destroy all living creatures on earth. Noah, at 600 years old, followed God's instructions completely, bringing his family and the animals into the ark. On the 17th day of the 2nd month were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights, causing waters to rise and lift the ark above the earth. The waters prevailed so mightily that they covered even the highest mountains by more than 20 feet. Every living thing on dry land, humans, animals, birds, and creatures that moved on the ground, perished in the flood. Only Noah and those with him in the ark survived. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days. Summary of Genesis 8. Genesis 8 is the account of the conclusion of the global flood and Noah's emergence from the ark. God remembered Noah and all the creatures in the ark and sent a wind to help the floodwaters recede. After 150 days, the waters began to decrease. On the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters continued to recede. By the 1st day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible. After 40 more days, Noah opened the window of the ark and sent out a raven, which flew back and forth until the earth was dry. He then sent out a dove, which returned, finding no place to rest. 7 days later, he sent the dove again, and it returned with a freshly plucked olive leaf, indicating the waters had receded. After another 7 days, he sent the dove once more, and this time it didn't return. When Noah was 601 years old, on the 1st day of the 1st month, the waters had dried from the earth. By the 27th day of the 2nd month, the earth was completely dry. God then commanded Noah to leave the ark with his family and all the animals, instructing them to be fruitful and multiply on the earth. After exiting, Noah built an altar and offered burnt offerings from the clean animals. God was pleased with the sacrifice and promised never again to curse the ground because of humans or destroy all living creatures this way. Summary of Genesis 9. Genesis 9 describes God's covenant with Noah after the floodwaters receded. God blessed Noah and his sons, telling them to be fruitful and multiply, to repopulate the earth. God established a new relationship between humans and animals, saying animals would now fear humans, and humans were now permitted to eat animals for food. God prohibited eating meat with blood still in it, and established the sanctity of human life, declaring that whoever shed human blood would have their blood shed in return. God made a covenant with Noah, promising never to destroy all life with a flood again, and he established the rainbow as the sign of this covenant. After the flood, Noah planted a vineyard, made wine, became drunk, and lay uncovered in his tent. Ham saw his father's nakedness and told his brothers, but Shem and Japheth respectfully covered their father without looking at him. When Noah woke up, he cursed Canaan, Ham's son, to be a servant to his brothers, and he blessed Shem and Japheth. Genesis 9 concludes by noting that Noah lived 350 years after the flood, dying at age 950. Summary of Genesis 10. Genesis 10, often called the Table of Nations, provides a genealogical record of Noah's descendants through his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and how they populated the earth after the flood. The chapter begins with Japheth's descendants, who generally settled in the regions of Asia Minor, the Mediterranean islands, and parts of Europe. Notable descendants include Gomer, Magog, Madai, Yavan, and others who became ancestors of various peoples and nations. Ham's descendants are listed next, including Cush, Mitzrayim, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. This section specifically mentions Nimrod, a son of Cush described as a mighty hunter before the Lord, who established kingdoms in Mesopotamia, including Babel. The descendants of Canaan became the Canaanite peoples, who settled in the land that would later be promised to Abraham. Genesis 10 then details Shem's descendants, who primarily settled in the Middle East and became ancestors of the Semitic peoples, including the Hebrews. Notable descendants include Elam, Ashur, Arpachshad, an ancestor of Abraham, Lud, and Aram. The chapter concludes by explaining that these are the families of Noah's sons according to their genealogies and nations. From these, the nations spread over the earth after the flood. Summary of Genesis 11. Genesis 11 consists of two main sections, the Tower of Babel and the genealogy of Shem to Abram. At this time, all people on earth spoke the same language. They settled in the plain of Shinar, Babylonia. They decided to build a city with a tower reaching to the heavens to make a name for themselves and avoid being scattered. God came down to see the city and tower. He was concerned about what humans might achieve if they remained united with one language. So he confused their language so they couldn't understand each other. This caused people to scatter across the earth. The city was called Babel because God confused the language of the world there. The Hebrew word Babel, or Bavel, is rooted in the word balal, which means to confuse. Genesis 11 also records the descendants of Shem, one of Noah's sons, tracing the lineage from Shem to Terah, the father of Abram, later renamed Abraham. The record shows the gradual decrease in human lifespan after the flood. The genealogy ends with Terah taking his family, including Abram, from Ur of the Chaldees toward Canaan. They settled in Haran, where Terah died. Summary of Genesis 12. Genesis 12 marks a pivotal turning point in the Bible with the call of Abram, later renamed Abraham, and God's covenant with him. God's call to Abram, verses 1 to 3. God commanded Abram to leave his country, his relatives, and his father's house to go to a land that God would show him. God promised to make Abram into a great nation, bless him, make his name great, and make him a blessing to others. God further promised to bless those who blessed Abram, and cursed those who cursed him, declaring that all people on earth would be blessed through him. Abram's journey, verses 4 to 9. At 75 years old, Abram obeyed God's call and departed from Haran with his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all their servants and possessions. They traveled to Canaan, where God appeared to Abram and promised to give this land to his descendants. Abram built altars to the Lord at Shechem and Bethel before continuing his journey toward the Negev. Abram in Egypt, verses 10 to 20. A severe famine struck Canaan, forcing Abram to seek refuge in Egypt. Fearing that the Egyptians might kill him to take his beautiful wife Sarai, Abram instructed her to say she was his sister. She was his half-sister. As anticipated, Pharaoh's officials noticed Sarai's beauty and took her into Pharaoh's palace, while Pharaoh rewarded Abram with livestock and servants. But God afflicted Pharaoh and his household with serious diseases because of Sarai. When Pharaoh discovered the truth, he confronted Abram, returned Sarai, and ordered them to leave Egypt. Summary of Genesis 13. Genesis 13 is the account of Abram and his nephew Lot separating due to conflicts between their herdsmen. After returning from Egypt to Canaan with his wife Sarai and Lot, Abram was very wealthy with livestock, silver, and gold. They traveled to Bethel, where Abram had previously built an altar. Both Abram and Lot had accumulated so many possessions and livestock that the land couldn't support them living together. Their herdsmen began quarreling over grazing land and water resources. To resolve this conflict, Abram generously offered Lot the choice of land. Lot chose the well-watered plain of Jordan near Sodom, which is described as being like the garden of the Lord, while Abram remained in Canaan. After their separation, God spoke to Abram and renewed his promise, telling him to look in all directions, north, south, east, and west, promising to give all the land he could see to him and his descendants forever. God also promised that Abram's offspring would be as numerous as the dust of the earth. Abram then moved his tents to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he built another altar to the Lord. Summary of Genesis 14. Genesis 14 is an account of a regional war and Abram's rescue of his nephew Lot. 4 kings waged war against 5 kings from the region of Sodom and Gomorrah. The 5 kings had been subject to Kedorlaomer for 12 years, but rebelled in the 13th year. In the 14th year, Kedorlaomer and his allies attacked and defeated several peoples in the region before confronting the 5 kings in the valley of Siddim. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell into tar pits, while the rest escaped to the hills. The victorious 4 kings plundered Sodom and Gomorrah, taking their possessions and food supplies. Lot, Abram's nephew who was living in Sodom, was captured along with his possessions. When Abram learned of Lot's capture, he gathered 318 trained men from his household and pursued the 4 kings, defeating them near Damascus and recovering all the captives and goods. After Abram's victory, 2 significant encounters occurred. Melchizedek, king of Salem, and the priest of the Most High God, brought out bread and wine and blessed Abram. Abram gave Melchizedek 1/10 of everything. The king of Sodom offered Abram the goods, while requesting the return of his people. Abram refused to take anything except what his men ate and a share for his allies. Summary of Genesis 15. Genesis 15 centers on God's covenant with Abram, later renamed Abraham. God appeared to Abram in a vision, telling him not to fear and promising to be his shield and very great reward. Abram expressed concern about remaining childless, noting that his servant Eliezer stood to inherit his household. God reassured Abram that his heir would come from his own body. God took Abram outside and told him to count the stars, promising his descendants would be just as numerous. Abram believed God's promise, and this faith was credited to him as righteousness. God then identified himself as the Lord who brought Abram from Ur of the Chaldees to give him the land of Canaan. When Abram asked for assurance regarding the promised land, God instructed him to bring specific animals for a covenant ceremony. Abram prepared the animals, except the birds, by cutting them in half, and he drove away birds of prey that attempted to eat the carcasses. As the sun set, Abram fell into a deep sleep. God revealed that Abram's descendants would be strangers and slaves in a foreign land before returning to Canaan. After darkness fell, a smoking fire pot and flaming torch, representing God's presence, passed between the animal pieces, formally establishing the covenant. God defined the boundaries of the land promised to Abram's descendants, from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates. Summary of Genesis 16. Genesis 16 provides an account of Sarai, Abram's wife, her Egyptian servant Hagar, and the birth of Ishmael. After 10 years in Canaan with no children, Sarai suggested that Abram have a child with her servant Hagar, following a common custom of that time. Abram agreed, and Hagar became pregnant. Once pregnant, Hagar began to look down on Sarai, who then treated Hagar harshly in response. Hagar ran away to the desert, where an angel of the Lord found her near a spring. The angel told her to return to Sarai and submit to her authority. The angel also gave Hagar a promise. She would have many descendants through her son, whom she should name Ishmael, which means God hears, because the Lord had heard her affliction. The angel prophesied that Ishmael would be a wild man, whose hand would be against everyone, and everyone's hand would be against him. Hagar returned and gave birth to Ishmael when Abram was 86 years old. Summary of Genesis 17. Genesis 17 depicts God's covenant with Abram when he was 99 years old. God appeared to Abram, identified himself as the Almighty God, El Shaddai, and established a covenant with several elements. God changed Abram's name to Abraham, which means father of many nations, and promised that kings would come from his line. The covenant was established as an everlasting covenant between God and Abraham's descendants. God promised the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession. He instituted circumcision as the sign of the covenant. Each male was to be circumcised 8 days after his birth. God changed Sarai's name to Sarah, which means noblewoman or princess, and promised she would bear a son despite being 90 years old. Abraham laughed at the idea of having a child at his age, but God confirmed Sarah would have a son named Isaac. Abraham asked God to bless Ishmael, his son with Hagar, and God promised to make him fruitful as well. Abraham, Ishmael, and all the males in Abraham's household were circumcised that same day. Summary of Genesis 18. Genesis 18 is the account of Abraham's encounter with 3 visitors at the Oaks of Mamre and God's revelation about the coming judgment on Sodom. The chapter begins with the Lord appearing to Abraham by the Oaks of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance of his tent during the heat of the day. Abraham saw 3 men approaching, rushed to meet them, and offered generous hospitality. He had Sarah prepare bread while he selected a choice calf to be prepared, and he served them under a tree. During the meal, the visitors asked about Sarah's whereabouts and then announced that when they return in a year, Sarah would have a son. Sarah, listening from the tent entrance, laughed to herself in disbelief because both she and Abraham were elderly. The Lord questioned why Sarah laughed and reminded them that nothing is too difficult for the Lord. Sarah denied laughing out of fear, but the Lord confirmed she did just that. As the men prepared to leave and go toward Sodom, the Lord decided to reveal his plans to Abraham. The Lord told Abraham about the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah due to their grave sin, and said that he would go investigate the situation. This led to a remarkable negotiation between Abraham and the Lord. Abraham approached and asked if the Lord would destroy the righteous with the wicked. He began by asking if the Lord would spare the city if 50 righteous people were found there. God agreed, and Abraham progressively lowered the number from 50 to 45 to 40 to 30 to 20, and finally to 10. Each time, the Lord agreed to spare the city if that number of righteous people could be found. Genesis 18 ends with the Lord leaving after this conversation, and Abraham returning to his place. Summary of Genesis 19. Genesis 19 recounts the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, focusing on the rescue of Lot and his family. The chapter begins with 2 angels arriving in Sodom, where Lot insisted they stay at his house. Before they retired for the night, the men of Sodom surrounded Lot's house, demanding to, quote-unquote, know the visitors. Lot refused and offered his daughters instead, but the angels struck the men with blindness, and warned Lot to flee with his family because God planned to destroy the city for its wickedness. At dawn, the angels urged Lot to leave immediately. When he hesitated, they took him, his wife, and 2 daughters by the hand and led them outside the city, instructing them to flee to the mountains and to not look back. Lot negotiated to go to the small town of Zoar instead. As Lot reached Zoar, God rained sulfur and fire upon Sodom and Gomorrah, destroying the cities and all inhabitants. Lot's wife looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. Genesis 19 concludes with Lot and his daughters living in a cave in the mountains. Believing they were the only survivors, the daughters got their father drunk on successive nights and slept with him to preserve their family line. Each daughter bore a son: Moab, father of the Moabites, and Ben-Ammi, father of the Ammonites. Summary of Genesis 20. Genesis 20 provides an account of Abraham's sojourn in Gerar. Abraham moved to the region of Gerar, where he told people that his wife Sarah was his sister, similar to his earlier deception in Egypt. King Abimelech of Gerar took Sarah into his harem, not knowing she was already married. God appeared to Abimelech in a dream, warning him that Sarah was a married woman and that he was as good as dead for taking her. Abimelech, who had not yet approached Sarah, protested his innocence to God, saying he acted with a clear conscience, since Abraham claimed she was his sister. God acknowledged Abimelech's innocence, but instructed him to return Sarah to Abraham, who was a prophet who would pray for him. Abimelech confronted Abraham about the deception. Abraham explained he feared for his life because he thought there was no fear of God in Gerar, and technically Sarah was his half-sister. Abimelech gave Abraham livestock, servants, and silver as compensation, and he invited him to live in his land wherever he pleased. Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and female servants so they could bear children again. God had closed all the wombs in Abimelech's household because of Sarah. Summary of Genesis 21. Genesis 21 focuses on 3 events in Abraham's life: the birth of Isaac, the banishment of Hagar and Ishmael, and the covenant with Abimelech. The birth of Isaac. As God promised, Sarah gave birth to Abraham's son Isaac when Abraham was 100 years old. Isaac's name means laughter, reflecting Sarah's joy and initial disbelief that she would bear a child in her old age. Abraham circumcised Isaac on the 8th day as commanded by God. Hagar and Ishmael's banishment. After Isaac was weaned, Sarah saw Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son by Hagar, mocking Isaac. Sarah demanded that Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael away. Though upset, Abraham obeyed after God reassured him that Ishmael would also become a nation. Hagar and Ishmael nearly died in the wilderness until God provided water and promised that Ishmael would become a great nation. Ishmael grew up in the wilderness of Paran and became an archer. The covenant with Abimelech. Abimelech, king of Gerar, recognized God's favor on Abraham and proposed a treaty of peace between them. Abraham agreed, but raised an issue about a well that Abimelech's servants had seized. They resolved the dispute, and Abraham planted a grove at Beersheba, which means well of the sevenfold oath, to commemorate their covenant. Abraham continued to stay in Philistine territory. Summary of Genesis 22. Genesis 22 is the account of God testing Abraham by commanding him to offer up his son Isaac as a sacrifice on a mountain in the land of Moriah. This is the same Isaac who was miraculously born to Abraham and Sarah in their old age, and through whom God had promised to establish his covenant. Abraham obeyed without question, taking Isaac on a 3-day journey to the designated place. He had his servants wait while he and Isaac proceeded alone up the mountain. Isaac, carrying the wood for the sacrifice, asked his father where the lamb for the offering was, to which Abraham cryptically responded, "God will provide himself a lamb." At the place God had told him, Abraham built an altar, arranged the wood, bound Isaac, and placed him on the altar. Just as Abraham took the knife to kill his son, an angel of the Lord called out, stopping him. The angel declared that Abraham had now demonstrated his fear of God by his willingness to offer his only son as a sacrifice. Abraham saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns, which he sacrificed instead of Isaac. He named the place Jehovah-Jireh, meaning Jehovah will see to it. Following this test of faith, God reaffirmed his covenant with Abraham, promising to multiply his descendants as numerous as the stars, and that through his offspring, all nations on earth would be blessed because of his obedience. Genesis 22 concludes with a brief genealogy mentioning Abraham's brother Nahor and his children, including Rebekah. Summary of Genesis 23. Genesis 23 focuses on the death of Sarah and Abraham's purchase of a burial site for her. Sarah died at the age of 127 in Hebron, also called Kiriath Arba, in the land of Canaan. Abraham mourned his loss and then looked for a burial place. Abraham approached the Hittites, acknowledging himself as a stranger and a sojourner with them, and asked to purchase land for a burial site. The Hittites respectfully offered to let him use any of their tombs. Abraham specifically requested to buy the cave of Machpelah from Ephron the Hittite. Though Ephron initially offered to give Abraham both the field and the cave as a gift, Abraham insisted on paying the full price. Ephron named his price of 400 shekels of silver, which Abraham weighed out and paid in full. The transaction was formalized in the presence of witnesses at the city gate. The field, cave, and all the trees within its boundaries became Abraham's legal property, and he buried Sarah there. This purchase established Abraham's first legal claim to property in the Promised Land. Summary of Genesis 24. Genesis 24 is the account of how Abraham's servant found a wife for Isaac. Abraham, now old, wanted to ensure his son Isaac would marry someone from his homeland, not a Canaanite woman. He made his most trusted servant swear to find Isaac a wife from Abraham's relatives in Mesopotamia. The servant traveled to the city of Nahor with 10 camels and valuable gifts. Outside the city, he prayed for a sign. The woman who offered to provide water for both him and his camels would be the one God chose for Isaac. Before he finished praying, Rebekah appeared. She not only gave him water, but voluntarily offered to water all his camels too, fulfilling the exact sign he had requested. The servant learned she was the daughter of Bethuel, who was Abraham's nephew. The servant praised God for guiding him, and then he gave Rebekah gold jewelry. She invited him to stay with her family, where he explained his mission and how God had clearly indicated Rebekah as the chosen bride. Her brother Laban and father Bethuel recognized God's hand in the matter and agreed to the marriage. The next day, despite their request to delay her departure, Rebekah chose to leave immediately with the servant. When they arrived in Canaan, Isaac was out meditating in the fields. Rebekah covered herself with a veil upon seeing him. The servant told Isaac everything that had happened, and Isaac married Rebekah, finding comfort in her love after his mother Sarah's death. Summary of Genesis 25. Genesis 25 can be divided into 3 main sections: Abraham's final years and death, Ishmael's descendants, and Jacob and Esau's birth and rivalry. Abraham's final years and death, verses 1 to 11. Abraham married Keturah after Sarah's death and had 6 more sons. Abraham gave gifts to these sons and sent them away eastward. Abraham left everything else to Isaac, his son with Sarah. Abraham died at age 175 and was buried with Sarah in the cave of Machpelah. Isaac settled near Lahairoi after Abraham's death. Ishmael's descendants, verses 12 to 18. The 12 sons of Ishmael became tribal leaders. Ishmael died at age 137. His descendants settled from Havilah to Shur, east of Egypt. Jacob and Esau's birth and rivalry, verses 19 to 34. Isaac, at age 40, married Rebekah, who was initially barren. Isaac prayed for Rebekah, and she conceived twins. During pregnancy, the babies struggled within her womb. God revealed to Rebekah that 2 nations were in her womb, and the older would serve the younger. Esau was born first, reddish and hairy, followed by Jacob, grasping Esau's heel. Esau became a skilled hunter, while Jacob is described as a plain man, dwelling in tents. Isaac favored Esau, but Rebekah favored Jacob. Esau sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of stew when he came home famished from hunting. Summary of Genesis 26. Genesis 26 focuses on Isaac's experiences during a famine and his interactions with the Philistines. During a famine, God instructed Isaac not to go to Egypt, but to stay in Gerar, reaffirming the covenant promises made to Abraham. Like his father Abraham had done, Isaac told the people of Gerar that Rebekah was his sister rather than his wife, fearing they might kill him because of her beauty. King Abimelech discovered the truth when he saw Isaac sporting with Rebekah and confronted him. He commanded his people not to harm Isaac or Rebekah. Isaac prospered greatly in Gerar, growing wealthy with flocks, herds, and servants. His success caused the Philistines to envy him. They had filled up the wells that Abraham had dug. Abimelech asked Isaac to leave because he had become too powerful. Isaac moved to the valley of Gerar and reopened his father's wells. His servants dug new wells, but local herdsmen quarreled with Isaac's men over the water rights. After digging several contested wells, Isaac finally dug one that caused no disputes. Isaac moved to Beersheba, where God appeared to him and reassured him of the covenant promises. Abimelech and his officials sought a peace treaty with Isaac, recognizing that God was with him. They shared a feast and made a covenant. Esau, at age 40, married 2 Hittite women, which greatly upset Isaac and Rebekah. Summary of Genesis 27. Genesis 27 is the account of how Jacob deceived his father Isaac to steal the blessing intended for his older brother Esau. Isaac, now old and blind, felt death approaching and asked his favorite son, Esau, to hunt game and prepare a meal for him, after which he planned to give Esau his special blessing. Rebekah overheard this conversation and devised a plan to ensure her favorite son, Jacob, received the blessing instead. She prepared a meal and helped Jacob disguise himself as Esau by covering his smooth skin with goat skins and dressing him in Esau's clothes. When Jacob went to Isaac, pretending to be Esau, Isaac was suspicious because Jacob's voice didn't match Esau's. He felt Jacob's goatskin-covered hands and was convinced enough to proceed with the blessing, which included promises of abundance, dominion over nations, and curses for those who cursed him. Shortly after Jacob left, Esau returned with the prepared meal. Isaac and Esau both realized the deception, and Esau wept bitterly. Isaac couldn't revoke the blessing already given to Jacob, but offered Esau a lesser blessing that included living by the sword, and eventually breaking free from Jacob's dominion. Esau became enraged and planned to kill Jacob after their father died. When Rebekah learned of this threat, she told Jacob to go to her brother Laban's house in Haran under the pretext of finding a wife from her family rather than from the local Canaanites. Summary of Genesis 28. Genesis 28 focuses on Jacob's journey from Beersheba to Haran and his encounter with God at Bethel. Isaac called Jacob, blessed him, and instructed him not to marry a Canaanite woman. Instead, he was to go to Padan Aram, Mesopotamia, to find a wife from among his uncle Laban's daughters. Jacob left Beersheba and headed toward Haran. While sleeping at a certain place along the journey, Jacob had a remarkable dream. He saw a ladder reaching from earth to heaven. Angels of God were ascending and descending on it. The Lord stood above it and spoke to Jacob. In his dream, the Lord God renewed the covenant previously made with Abraham and Isaac. He promised the land on which Jacob lay to him and his descendants. Jacob's descendants would be numerous and spread in all directions. All peoples on earth would be blessed through Jacob and his descendants. The Lord would be with Jacob, protect him, and bring him back to this land. When Jacob woke up, he realized the sacred nature of the place. Jacob took the stone he had used as a pillow and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on it. He named the place Bethel, House of God, though it was previously called Luz. Jacob made a vow to God. If God protected him, provided for him, and brought him back safely, then the Lord would be his God. This pillar would be God's house, and he would give God 1/10 of everything he received. Summary of Genesis 29. Genesis 29 focuses on Jacob's arrival in Haran and his marriages to Leah and Rachel, daughters of his uncle Laban. Jacob arrived in Haran and met Rachel at a well, where shepherds were gathering. He removed a stone covering the well and watered her flock. Jacob identified himself as Rachel's relative, Rebekah's son, kissed her, and wept. Rachel ran to tell her father Laban. Laban welcomed Jacob into his home. After a month, Laban offered Jacob wages for his work. Jacob fell in love with Rachel, Laban's younger daughter, and offered to work 7 years for her hand in marriage. Laban agreed. The 7 years passed quickly for Jacob because of his love for Rachel. On the wedding night, Laban deceived Jacob by substituting his older daughter, Leah, in the darkness. When Jacob discovered the deception the next morning, he confronted Laban, who explained it was not their custom to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Laban offered Rachel to Jacob in exchange for another 7 years of service after completing the bridal week with Leah. Jacob agreed and married Rachel as well, though he loved Rachel more than Leah. Genesis 29 concludes with Leah bearing 4 sons for Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, while Rachel remained barren. Summary of Genesis 30. Genesis 30 focuses on the competition between Jacob's wives, Rachel and Leah, to bear children, and Jacob's growing prosperity while working for his father-in-law, Laban. The chapter begins with Rachel's desperation over her barrenness, while her sister Leah had already borne 4 sons. In her envy, Rachel gave Jacob her maidservant Bilhah as a concubine to bear children, quote, upon my knees, unquote, a cultural practice in which the children were legally considered Rachel's. Bilhah bore 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. Not to be outdone, Leah, who had temporarily stopped bearing children, gave Jacob her maidservant, Zilpah, who bore Gad and Asher. Later, Leah traded mandrakes, plants believed to help with fertility, that her son Reuben found, to Rachel in exchange for a night with Jacob. Leah bore 2 more sons, Issachar and Zebulun, and a daughter named Dinah. Finally, God remembered Rachel and opened her womb. She bore Joseph and expressed hope for another son. Jacob negotiated with Laban to begin building his own flocks. They agreed that Jacob could keep all the speckled, spotted, and dark-colored animals as his wages. Jacob then used a breeding technique entailing peeled branches to produce strong, streaked animals for himself, while the weaker ones went to Laban. Through this strategy, Jacob grew exceedingly prosperous, with large flocks and many servants. Summary of Genesis 31. Genesis 31 is the account of Jacob's departure from Laban's household after 20 years of service. Jacob noticed that Laban and his sons had become hostile toward him because they believed Jacob had become wealthy at their expense. God instructed Jacob to return to his homeland. Jacob called Rachel and Leah to meet him in the field, where he explained how Laban had cheated him by changing his wages 10 times. Still, God had blessed him and transferred Laban's wealth to him. Jacob told them about a dream in which God instructed him to leave. Rachel and Leah agreed to go, noting that their father had treated them like foreigners and consumed their inheritance. While Laban was away shearing sheep, Jacob gathered his family and possessions and fled toward Canaan. Before leaving, Rachel secretly stole her father's household idols. 3 days later, Laban discovered Jacob's departure and pursued him, catching up after 7 days in the hill country of Gilead. God warned Laban in a dream not to harm Jacob. When they met, Laban confronted Jacob about leaving secretly and stealing his household gods. Jacob allowed Laban to search for the idols, unaware that Rachel had hidden them under a camel's saddle she was sitting on, claiming she couldn't rise due to her menstrual period. After a fruitless search, Jacob angrily rebuked Laban, reminding Laban of his faithful service despite poor treatment. He reminded Laban how he worked 14 years for his daughters and 6 more years for his flocks, while enduring changing wages and harsh conditions. Finally, Jacob and Laban made a covenant, building a stone pillar as a witness that neither would cross to harm the other. Jacob called the place Galaad, but it's best known as Mizpah. Laban said, "The Lord watch between me and thee, when we are absent one from another." Jacob and Laban shared a meal. The next morning, Laban kissed his daughters and grandchildren goodbye before returning home, and Jacob continued his journey toward Canaan. Summary of Genesis 32. Genesis 32 recounts a pivotal moment in Jacob's life as he prepared to reunite with his estranged brother Esau after 20 years. The chapter begins with Jacob continuing his journey home after leaving his father-in-law Laban. Angels of God met him on the way, and Jacob called the place Mahanaim, meaning 2 camps. As he approached his homeland, Jacob sent messengers ahead to Esau, humbly announcing his return and seeking favor. The messengers returned with alarming news. Esau was coming to meet Jacob with 400 men. Terrified of his brother's potential revenge for stealing his birthright and blessing, Jacob divided his household into 2 groups, hoping at least one might escape if Esau attacked. Then Jacob prayed earnestly to God, acknowledging his unworthiness of God's faithfulness, God's mercies and truth, and asking for deliverance from Esau. He reminded God of the promise to make his descendants as numerous as the sand. As a strategic gesture, Jacob sent waves of generous gifts ahead to Esau: goats, sheep, camels, cattle, and donkeys, hoping to appease his brother. That night, after sending his wives, children, and possessions across the Jabbok River, Jacob remained alone. A mysterious man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man couldn't overpower Jacob, he touched Jacob's hip socket, wrenching it. Despite his injury, Jacob refused to let go until the man blessed him. The man renamed Jacob Israel, meaning God prevails, acknowledging that Jacob had power with God and with humans and had prevailed. Jacob named the place Penuel, meaning facing God, saying, I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. As the sun rose, Jacob limped away because of his injured hip. Summary of Genesis 33. Genesis 33 recounts the emotional reunion between Jacob and his estranged brother Esau after 20 years of separation. Jacob, anxious about meeting Esau, who once threatened to kill him, strategically arranged his family in groups, with his most beloved, Rachel and Joseph, at the rear for protection. When Jacob saw Esau approaching with 400 men, he moved ahead and bowed to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. Contrary to Jacob's fears, Esau ran to meet him with open arms. They embraced and wept together. Esau initially refused Jacob's generous gifts, saying he had enough. Jacob insisted that Esau accept them as a sign of reconciliation and finding favor with him. Esau offered to escort Jacob, but Jacob politely declined, explaining that his children and flocks needed to travel slowly. Esau returned to Seir, while Jacob journeyed to Sukkoth, where he built a house and shelters for his livestock. Later, Jacob moved to Shechem in Canaan, purchased land from the sons of Hamor, and set up an altar called El Eloach Yisrael, which means God, the God of Israel. Summary of Genesis 34. Genesis 34 is the account of Dinah and the Shechemites. Jacob's daughter Dinah went out to visit the women of the land. Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, the local ruler, saw her, he took her, and lay with her, and defiled her. Shechem fell in love with Dinah, and asked his father to arrange a marriage. Hamor approached Jacob about the marriage and proposed an alliance between their peoples, offering intermarriage and land. Jacob's sons, upon hearing what happened to their sister, were furious about the dishonor brought upon their family. When negotiating with Hamor and Shechem, Jacob's sons proposed that all the men of the city must be circumcised before any marriage could take place, but it turned out to be a setup. Shechem and Hamor agreed to this condition and convinced all the men of their city to undergo circumcision. While the men were recovering and in pain, 2 of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's full brothers, attacked the city, killed all the men, and took Dinah home. The other brothers then plundered the city, taking wealth, livestock, women, and children. Summary of Genesis 35. Genesis 35 recounts Jacob's journey back to Bethel and several significant family events that follow. God instructed Jacob to go to Bethel, where he had earlier fled from his brother Esau, and to build an altar there. Jacob prepared his household by having them put away their foreign gods, purify themselves, and change their clothes before the journey. God protected Jacob's family as they traveled, causing terror to fall on the surrounding towns so no one pursued them. At Bethel, Jacob built an altar and named it El Bethel, which means God of Bethel. Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died and was buried there. God appeared to Jacob again, reaffirmed his name change to Israel, and repeated the covenant promises about descendants and land. Jacob set up a stone pillar at this place of divine encounter. As they journeyed from Bethel toward Ephrath, which is Bethlehem, Rachel went into difficult labor and died while giving birth to Benjamin. Jacob set up a pillar at her grave. While in that region, Jacob's eldest son Reuben slept with Bilhah, his father's concubine, a serious transgression noted but not immediately addressed. Genesis 35 lists all 12 sons of Jacob, grouped by their mothers. Finally, Jacob returned to his father Isaac at Mamre, which is Hebron. And the chapter ends with Isaac's death at 180 years old, and his burial by both his sons, Esau and Jacob. Summary of Genesis 36. Genesis 36 provides detailed genealogical information about Esau, also called Edom, and his descendants. Esau took wives from among the Canaanites, Adah, Aholibamah, and Bosmath, and had 5 sons with them, Eliphaz, Reuel, Yeush, Yalam, and Korah. Esau moved his family, possessions, and livestock away from his brother Jacob to the hill country of Seir, because the land could not support both of their large herds. The chapter then lists the descendants of Esau through his sons, identifying them as the chiefs of various clans of Edom. Special attention is given to Eliphaz's son, Amalek, whose descendants would later become significant enemies of Israel. The text also records that Esau's descendants became the Edomite nation. Genesis 36 includes information about the original inhabitants of Seir, the Horites, and lists their tribal chiefs. It then provides a record of the kings who ruled in Edom before any king ruled over the Israelites. 8 kings are named in succession, beginning with Bela, son of Beor, and ending with Hadad, along with their cities and notable details about some of them. The chapter concludes with another listing of the chiefs of Esau according to their clans and territories. This extensive genealogical information points to Esau's significant legacy as the father of the Edomites, who would have a complex relationship with Israel throughout their history. Summary of Genesis 37. Genesis 37 begins to develop the account of Joseph, the favored son of Jacob. At 17, Joseph tended flocks with his brothers, but he brought bad reports about them to their father. Jacob showed his preference for Joseph by giving him a coat of many colors, causing his brothers to hate him and speak harshly to him. Joseph's position worsened when he shared 2 dreams suggesting his family would bow down to him. In the first dream, his brothers' sheaves of grain bowed to his sheaf. In the second, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed to him. These dreams infuriated his brothers even more. Even his father rebuked him and pondered what these dreams might have meant. Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers while they were tending flocks near Shechem. The brothers saw him approaching from a distance and plotted to kill him. Reuben, the oldest, intervened and convinced them to throw Joseph into a pit instead, planning to rescue him later. The brothers stripped Joseph of his special coat and threw him into the pit. While eating, they noticed a caravan of Ishmaelite merchants passing by. Judah proposed selling Joseph rather than killing him, reasoning they shouldn't shed their brother's blood. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the merchants. When Reuben returned and found Joseph missing, he tore his clothes in distress. The brothers then devised a plan to deceive their father. They took Joseph's robe, dipped it in goat's blood, and presented it to Jacob, leading him to believe a wild animal had devoured his son. Jacob mourned deeply, tearing his clothes and refusing to be comforted, saying he would mourn until he joined his son in death. Meanwhile, the Midianite merchants sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. Summary of Genesis 38. Genesis 38 interrupts the account of Joseph to discuss Judah and his family. After moving away from his brothers, Judah married a Canaanite woman and had 3 sons, Er, Onan, and Shelah. Judah arranged for his firstborn, Er, to marry a woman named Tamar. But Er was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him before Er could produce an heir. Following custom, Judah instructed his second son, Onan, to fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law by marrying Tamar and providing children for his dead brother. However, Onan, knowing that any child born would not be considered his own, deliberately spilled his seed on the ground during intercourse. This displeased God, who put Onan to death as well. Judah then promised Tamar that his third son, Shelah, would marry her when he grew up. But, afraid that Shelah also might die, Judah delayed fulfilling this promise and sent Tamar back to her father's house to wait. As time passed, Tamar realized Judah had no intention of giving her to Shelah, even though Shelah had now grown up. When Tamar learned that Judah was traveling to shear his sheep, she removed her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil, and sat in an open place by the way to Timnah. Judah, not recognizing her, mistook her for a prostitute and propositioned her. She agreed on the condition that he give her his signet, bracelets, and staff as a pledge until he sent payment of a young goat. After their encounter, Tamar went back home and put her widow's garments back on. When Judah sent a friend to deliver the promised goat and retrieve his personal items, the woman couldn't be found. About 3 months later, Judah learned that Tamar was pregnant through prostitution. He angrily ordered that she be brought out and burned. As she was being brought out, Tamar produced Judah's signet, bracelets, and staff, saying, "By the man whose these are, am I with child." Judah recognized his items and acknowledged that Tamar was more righteous than he was, as he failed to give her to his son Shelah as promised. Judah didn't sleep with her again. When the time came for Tamar to give birth, she delivered twins. During the delivery, one twin, Zerah, put out his hand first, and the midwife tied a scarlet thread around it. But he drew back his hand, and his brother, Peretz, came out first. Summary of Genesis 39. Genesis 39 follows Joseph after his brothers sold him into slavery in Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian official and captain of Pharaoh's guard, purchased Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph, blessing everything he did, and Potiphar noticed. As a result, Potiphar placed Joseph in charge of his entire household and possessions, and the Lord blessed Potiphar's house because of Joseph. Joseph was a goodly person and well-favored, and he attracted the attention of Potiphar's wife. She repeatedly propositioned Joseph, asking him to sleep with her, but Joseph consistently refused, explaining it would be a sin against God and a betrayal of his master's trust. One day, when no one else was in the house, Potiphar's wife caught Joseph by his cloak and demanded he sleep with her. Joseph fled, leaving his cloak behind in her hand. Potiphar's wife used Joseph's cloak as evidence to falsely accuse him of attempted rape. She told her household servants and later her husband that Joseph had tried to assault her, but she had screamed, causing him to flee and leave his garment behind. When Potiphar heard this accusation, he became angry and had Joseph thrown into the prison where the king's prisoners were held. Even in prison, the Lord remained with Joseph and showed him kindness. The prison warden noticed Joseph's reliability and placed him in charge of all the other prisoners and prison operations. Whatever Joseph did, the Lord made it prosper. Summary of Genesis 40. Genesis 40 is the account of Joseph's encounter with two fellow prisoners in the Egyptian dungeon where he was being held. While Joseph was imprisoned on false charges, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker were thrown into the same prison after they had offended their master. The captain of the guard assigned Joseph to serve them during their imprisonment. One morning, Joseph noticed that both men appeared troubled. When he asked about their condition, they explained that they had each experienced a dream the previous night, but had no one to interpret its meaning. Joseph told them that interpretations belong to God, and he asked them to share their dreams with him. The chief cupbearer spoke first, describing his dream of a vine with 3 branches that budded, blossomed, and produced ripe grapes. In the dream, he had squeezed the grapes into Pharaoh's cup and placed it in Pharaoh's hand. Joseph interpreted this as a favorable sign, explaining that the 3 branches represented 3 days, and that within 3 days Pharaoh would restore the cupbearer to his former position. Next, the chief baker shared his dream. He had seen 3 white baskets on his head, with the top basket containing baked goods for Pharaoh, but birds were eating from it. Joseph delivered a much grimmer interpretation, explaining that the 3 baskets also represented 3 days, but that within this time Pharaoh would execute the baker and hang his body on a pole, where birds would eat his flesh. Joseph made a personal appeal to the cupbearer, asking him to remember Joseph's kindness and mention his case to Pharaoh when he was restored. Joseph proclaimed his innocence, explaining that he had been kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews and had done nothing in Egypt to deserve imprisonment. 3 days later, on Pharaoh's birthday, both interpretations came to pass exactly as Joseph had predicted. Pharaoh restored the cupbearer to his position, but executed the baker. However, despite Joseph's request and the accuracy of his interpretation, the cupbearer forgot about Joseph and did not mention him to Pharaoh, leaving Joseph to remain in prison. Summary of Genesis 41. In Genesis 41, Pharaoh experienced 2 troubling dreams that none of his magicians or wise men could interpret. In the first dream, he saw 7 fat, healthy cows grazing by the river, followed by 7 thin, ugly cows that devoured the fat ones. In the second dream, 7 plump ears of grain grew on a single stalk, but 7 thin, scorched ears swallowed them up. These vivid dreams left Pharaoh deeply disturbed and searching for answers. The chief cupbearer, finally remembering Joseph's accurate interpretation of dreams in prison, spoke up and recommended Joseph to Pharaoh. Joseph was quickly summoned from the dungeon, cleaned up, and brought before the Egyptian ruler. When Pharaoh described his dreams, Joseph humbly credited God as the source of dream interpretation and explained that both dreams carried the same divine message about Egypt's future. Joseph revealed that the 7 fat cows and full ears represented 7 years of abundant harvests coming to Egypt, while the 7 thin cows and scorched ears symbolized 7 years of severe famine that would follow. He said that God had shown Pharaoh what he was about to do, and the repetition of the dream in 2 forms indicated that this plan was firmly established and would happen soon. The coming famine would be so severe that it would consume all memory of the preceding abundance. Recognizing the gravity of this revelation, Joseph boldly advised Pharaoh to find a wise administrator to oversee a systematic storage program during the 7 years of plenty. This person should collect 1/5 of Egypt's harvest each year and store it in cities under Pharaoh's authority, creating reserves that would sustain the nation through the devastating famine to come. Pharaoh and his officials were impressed by Joseph's wisdom and discernment. Pharaoh declared that since God had revealed these things to Joseph, no one was more qualified to implement the plan. He appointed Joseph as second in command over all of Egypt, giving him his signet ring, fine clothing, and a gold chain as symbols of authority. At 30 years old, Joseph was given an Egyptian name and married Asenath, daughter of an Egyptian priest. Genesis 41 concludes by describing the fulfillment of Joseph's interpretation. During the 7 years of abundance, Joseph efficiently collected and stored grain throughout Egypt in quantities so vast they stopped measuring it. He also had 2 sons during this period, Manasseh and Ephraim. When the 7 years of famine began as predicted, Joseph opened the storehouses and began selling grain not only to the Egyptians, but to people from surrounding nations who came to Egypt seeking relief from the widespread famine. Summary of Genesis 42. Genesis 42 provides an account of the severe famine that gripped the ancient Near East, including the land of Canaan, where Jacob and his family lived. When Jacob learned that grain was available for purchase in Egypt, he sent 10 of his sons to buy food, keeping only Benjamin, his youngest son and the full brother of the presumed dead Joseph, safely at home. Upon arriving in Egypt, the 10 brothers unknowingly came before Joseph, who had risen to become the second in command of all of Egypt, and oversaw the distribution of grain during the famine. Joseph immediately recognized his brothers, but they didn't recognize him after more than 20 years and his transformation into an Egyptian official. Rather than revealing his identity, Joseph decided to test his brothers, using an interpreter to speak to them roughly, and accusing them of being spies. The brothers vehemently denied the accusation, explaining that they were honest men, son of one father in Canaan, and that they had come only to buy food. They mentioned that they were originally 12 brothers, but one was not, and the youngest had remained at home with their father. Joseph continued his rough treatment, insisting that they prove their honesty. One of them must return home and then bring their youngest brother to Egypt, while the rest of them remained imprisoned as a guarantee. After keeping all the brothers in custody for 3 days, Joseph modified his demand, stating that only one brother would remain in prison, while the others returned home with grain. He required them to bring back their youngest brother as proof of their truthfulness, warning that otherwise they wouldn't see his face again. The brothers, speaking among themselves in Hebrew, and unaware that Joseph understood them, began to acknowledge their guilt regarding their treatment of Joseph years earlier, believing their current situation to be divine retribution for their past sins. Joseph, overhearing his brother's confession and expressions of remorse, was deeply moved and turned away to weep privately. He then returned and selected Simeon to remain bound before their eyes, while the others prepared to return to Canaan. Unknown to his brothers, Joseph secretly ordered his servants to return each brother's money to their grain sacks, along with provisions for their journey home. Genesis 42 concludes with the brothers' discovery of the returned money. First, when one opened his sack at a lodging place during the journey, and later when they all discovered their money back at home. This discovery filled them with fear as they wondered what God was doing to them. When they related all of this to Jacob, including Joseph's demand to see Benjamin and Simeon's imprisonment, Jacob was devastated, lamenting that he was being bereaved of his children and refusing to allow Benjamin to go to Egypt, declaring that if harm should come to Benjamin, it would bring his gray hairs down to the grave in sorrow. Summary of Genesis 43. Genesis 43 covers the famine that continued to ravage the land of Canaan, forcing Jacob's family to consider another journey to Egypt for grain. When their supplies ran low, Jacob instructed his sons to return to Egypt to buy more food. However, Judah reminded his father that the Egyptian official, whom they didn't know was Joseph, had sternly warned them not to return without their youngest brother, Benjamin. Jacob initially resisted sending Benjamin, expressing his fear of losing another beloved son after already mourning Joseph's apparent death. Judah stepped forward and offered to personally guarantee Benjamin's safety, pledging his own life as surety for his brother's return. He argued that if they hadn't waited, they could have made the trip twice already. Faced with the reality of starvation, Jacob reluctantly agreed to let Benjamin go. Before their departure, Jacob instructed his sons to take gifts for the Egyptian ruler. He also told them to take double the money, both to pay for the new grain and to return the money that had mysteriously appeared in their sacks after their previous trip. Jacob believed this might have been an oversight that could be corrected. When the brothers arrived in Egypt with Benjamin, Joseph saw them and instructed his steward to bring them to his house for a meal. This frightened the brothers, who assumed they were being brought to Joseph's house because of the money found in their sacks. They feared they would be accused of theft and enslaved. At the entrance to Joseph's house, they approached the steward and explained about the money, insisting they had brought it back along with additional money for more grain. The steward reassured them, telling them not to fear, and that their God must have put treasure in their sacks, as he had received their payment. He then brought their brother Simeon out to them. He had been held as a guarantee since their previous visit. As they prepared for the noon meal with Joseph, the brothers were given water to wash their feet, and their donkeys were fed. When Joseph came home, the brothers presented their gifts and bowed down before him, again fulfilling the dreams Joseph had shared with them years earlier. Joseph asked about their welfare and specifically inquired about their elderly father. When he saw Benjamin, his youngest brother, Joseph was overcome with emotion, but managed to control himself for a moment. He asked if this was their youngest brother and blessed Benjamin, and then quickly left the room to weep privately. After composing himself, Joseph returned and ordered the meal to be served. The Egyptians ate separately from the Hebrews due to cultural customs, and Joseph ate alone because of his high position. The brothers were seated in order of their ages, from oldest to youngest, which amazed them since they couldn't understand how this Egyptian official would know their birth order. Joseph sent portions from his table to his brothers, and Benjamin received 5 times as much as the others. Despite their initial fears, the brothers enjoyed their meal and the time with Joseph, not yet realizing they were dining with their long-lost brother. Summary of Genesis 44. Genesis 44 continues the account of Joseph testing his brothers who came to Egypt seeking grain during the famine. Joseph instructed his steward to fill his brothers' sacks with grain and to secretly place each man's money back in his sack. Most significantly, he ordered that his personal silver cup be hidden in Benjamin's sack, the youngest brother who was Jacob's beloved son and Joseph's only full brother. After the brothers left the city, Joseph sent his steward to pursue them with an accusation of theft. The steward confronted them about stealing his master's silver cup, which he claimed was used for divination. The brothers strongly denied the accusation and confidently declared that whoever was found with the cup should die, while the rest should become slaves. However, the steward proposed a more lenient punishment. Only the guilty party would become a slave, while the others could go free. When the sacks were searched from oldest to youngest, the cup was discovered in Benjamin's possession. The brothers were devastated and tore their clothes in anguish. They all returned to the city together, refusing to abandon Benjamin despite being given the opportunity to leave without him. Back in Joseph's presence, Judah took the lead as spokesman for his brothers. He acknowledged their apparent guilt while maintaining their innocence, recognizing that God had somehow exposed their past sins. When Joseph insisted that only Benjamin needed to remain as his slave, Judah explained that their father Jacob's life was bound up with Benjamin's welfare, describing how Jacob had lost one beloved son, Joseph, and how losing Benjamin would kill him. Judah said that he couldn't bear to see his father's grief and asked to substitute himself for Benjamin so that the young man could return home. Summary of Genesis 45. In Genesis 45, Joseph finally revealed his identity to his brothers who had sold him into slavery years earlier. Unable to control himself any longer in the presence of his Egyptian attendants, Joseph commanded everyone except his brothers to leave the room. In this private moment, he broke down weeping, so loudly that the Egyptians and Pharaoh's household could hear him from outside. Through his tears, Joseph declared to his stunned brothers, "I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live?" The brothers were so shocked and terrified that they couldn't answer him, struck speechless by the realization that the powerful Egyptian official before them was the very brother they had betrayed. Joseph, seeing their fear, gently called them closer and reassured them, explaining that while they intended evil against him, God used their actions for good. Joseph urged his brothers not to be angry with themselves or each other for selling him, pointing out that God sent him ahead to Egypt to save lives. He explained that there were still 5 more years of famine coming, and that God positioned him in Egypt to preserve their family line. In a remarkable display of forgiveness and eternal perspective, Joseph reframed their betrayal as part of God's sovereign plan to make him a father to Pharaoh and ruler over all of Egypt. The practical implications of this reunion quickly became apparent as Joseph instructed his brothers to return to Canaan and bring their father Jacob, along with all their families, livestock, and possessions, to settle in the land of Goshen in Egypt. Joseph promised to provide for them there during the remaining years of famine, ensuring they wouldn't become impoverished. He gave them wagons and provisions for the journey, along with changes of clothing for each brother, and special gifts of silver and garments for Benjamin. When Pharaoh learned that Joseph's brothers had come to Egypt, he enthusiastically endorsed the plan and instructed Joseph to tell his family to bring everything and that they would receive the good of the land of Egypt. The brothers arrived back in Canaan and told their father, "Joseph is yet alive, and he is governor over all the land of Egypt." Summary of Genesis 46. Genesis 46 recounts Jacob's journey to Egypt to reunite with his son Joseph, whom he had believed to be dead for many years. When Jacob learned that Joseph was not only alive, but also a powerful ruler in Egypt, he decided to travel there with his entire household. Before leaving, Jacob stopped at Beersheba to offer sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac, seeking God's guidance for this big decision. God appeared to Jacob in a vision during the night, reassuring him not to fear going down to Egypt. He promised to make Jacob into a great nation while in Egypt, and guaranteed that he would bring Jacob's descendants back to the Promised Land. God also assured Jacob that Joseph would be present to close his eyes when he died. Genesis 46 includes a detailed genealogical record of Jacob's family members who accompanied him to Egypt. This comprehensive list includes his sons and their children, totaling 70 people from Jacob's lineage who entered Egypt. The genealogy is organized by the mothers of Jacob's children, those born to Leah, Rachel, and the 2 maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah, creating a complete family record. Jacob sent Judah ahead to Joseph to get directions to Goshen, the region where they planned to settle. When Joseph learned of his family's arrival, he prepared his chariot and traveled to meet his father in Goshen. Joseph fell on his father's neck and wept for a long time, while Jacob expressed that he could now die in peace since he had seen Joseph alive again. Genesis 46 concludes with Joseph preparing to present his family to Pharaoh. He instructed his brothers on how to respond when Pharaoh asked about their occupation, advising them to identify themselves as keepers of livestock. Joseph explained this strategy would help ensure they could settle in Goshen, as shepherds were considered an abomination to the Egyptians, which would actually work in their favor by keeping them separate and allowing them to maintain their distinct identity in their designated region. Summary of Genesis 47. Genesis 47 continues the account of Jacob's family settling in Egypt during the severe famine. Joseph presented 5 of his brothers and his father Jacob to Pharaoh. When Pharaoh asked the brothers about their occupation, they identified themselves as shepherds and requested permission to settle in the land of Goshen, explaining that the famine had devastated their homeland of Canaan. Pharaoh welcomed them warmly and instructed Joseph to settle his family in the best part of Egypt, specifically in the region of Ramses, and to put any capable men among them in charge of Pharaoh's own livestock. Joseph then brought his father Jacob before Pharaoh for a formal introduction. The elderly patriarch blessed Pharaoh when meeting him and when leaving. When Pharaoh asked about Jacob's age, Jacob responded that he had lived 130 years, describing his life as a pilgrimage of few and difficult years that hadn't matched the lifespan of his ancestors. As the famine deepened and people exhausted their money to buy grain, Joseph accepted their livestock as payment. When their animals were gone, the people offered their land and themselves as servants to Pharaoh in exchange for food and seed. Through this process, Joseph centralized almost all of Egypt's land ownership under Pharaoh, with the notable exception of the priests' land, which Pharaoh had decreed should remain in their possession. Joseph established a new economic system in which the people became tenant farmers on what was formerly their own land, paying 1/5 of their harvest to Pharaoh, while keeping 4/5 for themselves. The people expressed gratitude for this arrangement, recognizing that Joseph had saved their lives. Meanwhile, the Israelites lived in Goshen. They had possessions and grew and multiplied exceedingly. Jacob lived in Egypt for 17 years, reaching the age of 147. As his death approached, he called Joseph to him and made him swear an oath. Jacob told Joseph not to bury him in Egypt, but instead to carry his body back to the burial place of his fathers in Canaan. Joseph agreed to this. Summary of Genesis 48. Genesis 48 recounts the final encounter between the aging patriarch Jacob, also called Israel, and his son Joseph, along with Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Jacob, who was nearing death, summoned Joseph to his bedside. Despite his physical weakness and failing eyesight, Jacob's spiritual authority remained strong as he prepared to pass on the covenant blessings that he himself had received from his father Isaac and grandfather Abraham. When Joseph arrived with his 2 sons, Jacob formally adopted Ephraim and Manasseh as his own sons, elevating them to the same status as his other children. This adoption was significant because it meant that Joseph's lineage would receive a double portion of inheritance through his 2 sons, effectively making Joseph the recipient of the firstborn's blessing, despite not being Jacob's oldest son. Jacob declared that these 2 grandsons would be counted among the tribes of Israel. During the blessing ceremony, Joseph carefully positioned his sons so that Manasseh, the older son, was at Jacob's right hand to receive the greater blessing, while Ephraim, the younger, was at Jacob's left. But Jacob deliberately crossed his hands, placing his right hand on Ephraim's head and his left on Manasseh's, thereby giving the greater blessing to the younger grandson, Ephraim. Joseph tried to correct what he assumed was his father's mistake due to poor eyesight, but Jacob insisted that his actions were intentional, prophesying that while both sons would become great, Ephraim would surpass his older brother in prominence. Genesis 48 concludes with Jacob's prophetic blessing over both grandsons, invoking the God of Abraham and Isaac, and asking that they be blessed with fruitfulness and multiplication. Jacob spoke of his own approaching death and assured Joseph that God would take him back to Canaan, the land of promise, where Jacob wanted Joseph to bury his body after his death. Summary of Genesis 49. Genesis 49 contains Jacob's final blessings and prophecies over his 12 sons before his death in Egypt. Jacob began with Reuben, his firstborn, acknowledging his natural right to preeminence, but declaring that he wouldn't excel due to his instability and his sin of defiling his father's bed with Bilhah. See Genesis 35. The next two sons, Simeon and Levi, were addressed together due to their shared violence, particularly their brutal revenge at Shechem. See Genesis 34. Jacob prophesied that they would be scattered in Israel, which historically came to pass as Simeon's territory was absorbed into Judah's. And the Levites, though later sanctified as priests, were given no territorial inheritance, but were dispersed among all the tribes. Judah received the most significant and memorable blessing, being promised that the scepter and ruler's staff would not depart from him until Shiloh come. Jacob prophesied royal leadership for Judah's line, describing him as a lion's cub who would be praised by his brothers. This blessing established Judah as the kingly tribe from which David and ultimately the Messiah would come, and included imagery of abundance and prosperity. Zebulun was blessed with a future by the seashore and involvement in maritime trade, while Issachar was characterized as a strong donkey who would choose security and good land over freedom, becoming a servant to tribute. Dan was promised to judge his people and was described as a serpent by the roadway, suggesting both justice and cunning in warfare. Gad would face raids, but would ultimately raid in return. Asher was blessed with rich food and royal delicacies, indicating a future of prosperity. Naphtali was described as a deer set free, who gives beautiful words, suggesting grace and eloquence. Joseph received an extensive and richly detailed blessing, being called a fruitful bough by a well, whose branches run over the wall. Jacob acknowledged the attacks and hardships Joseph endured, but declared that his bow remained steady, and his arms were made strong by the mighty God of Jacob. The blessing invoked multiple names for God and promised blessings of heaven above, the deep below, and the breast and womb, culminating in Joseph being set apart from his brothers. Finally, Benjamin was described as a ravenous wolf who devours prey in the morning and divides spoil in the evening, indicating a fierce and warlike nature for his descendants. After completing these individual prophecies, Jacob gave final instructions about his burial, requesting to be laid to rest with his fathers in the cave of Machpelah, before drawing up his feet into the bed and breathing his last. Summary of Genesis 50. Genesis 50 is the last chapter of the book of Genesis, bringing closure to the account of Joseph and the patriarchs. Upon Jacob's death, Joseph fell on his father's face, weeping and kissing him. He then commanded the physicians in his service to embalm Jacob's body, a process that took 40 days to complete, followed by 70 days of mourning by the Egyptians. After the mourning period, Joseph sought permission from Pharaoh to fulfill his oath to bury Jacob in the land of Canaan, specifically in the cave of Machpelah that Abraham had bought. Pharaoh granted this request, and Joseph embarked on the journey with a great company that included Egyptian officials, elders, and all of Joseph's household, along with his brothers and their father's household. Only the young children and flocks remained in Goshen. When they reached the threshing floor of Atad, beyond the Jordan, they held a great and solemn lamentation for 7 days. The burial took place as Jacob had requested, in the cave of Machpelah, in the field that Abraham had bought from Ephron the Hittite as a burial site. After fulfilling their father's wishes, Joseph and his brothers returned to Egypt. But Jacob's death brought concern to Joseph's brothers, who feared that, without their father's presence, Joseph might finally seek revenge for their past betrayal when they sold him into slavery years before. They sent word to Joseph, claiming that Jacob had instructed them before his death to ask Joseph to forgive their wrongdoing. When Joseph's brothers came and fell before him, offering to be his servants, Joseph wept and reassured them. He said, "Fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good." He spoke kindly to them and comforted them. Joseph lived to see his great-grandchildren and died at the age of 110 years. Before his death, he reminded his brothers of God's promise to bring their descendants back to the promised land, saying, "God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land unto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Joseph made the children of Israel swear an oath that when God would lead them out of Egypt, they would carry his bones with them. After his death, Joseph's body was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. This summary of the book of Genesis is part of the KJV Audio Bible podcast, which is available on YouTube and major podcast platforms. Subscribe to listen to God's Word today and every day.